In my usual Dornian Heresy builds, I focused mainly on turning the Loyalist legions from our timeline into their Chaos Corrupted counterparts. But this time around, I'll be focusing on a legion that fell to the tantalizing technologies of the Necrons. In this video, we'll explore just how far the Iron Hands could have been willing to go to transcend their organic bodies, because after all, the flesh is weak. But first, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, Boot.dev. Now, someone who has a software development background and spent 10 years working in the industry, I understand just how useful an ability being able to code is. It can open up job opportunities to you, or even just provide you with a fun and productive hobby. But getting started can be tricky, which is where Boot.dev comes in. They believe they have the solution for this, and that is to make sure that you're never bored while you're learning. Boot.dev is an online, self-paced learning platform where you'll learn back-end web development from start to finish in the Python and Go programming languages. If you're like me, you learn best from doing something rather than just reading or watching someone else do it. And that's why Boot.dev has you actually writing the code yourself in a way that makes you feel like you're playing an RPG game. As you're writing out those lines of code, you'll be earning XP, levels, achievements, and completing quests while you'll work your way up to the top spot on the global leaderboard. And if you're ever left scratching your head over a problem, then don't worry, because Boots the Bear Wizard has your back. Boots is an AI assistant that's been trained on each lesson and will help guide you in the right direction, giving you a chance to figure things out yourself. If you still find yourself stumped, you can always see the full solution to each lesson. The best way to learn coding is by doing it, and the best way to see what Boot.dev has is to try it out for yourself in guest mode, where you can try out the early challenges and even review their videos and text guides completely free. But if you're really wanting to get the most out of Boot.dev, then check out my link in the description below and use the code PETETheWargamer to get 25% off your first payment. Now that's 25% off your first month or your first year, depending on which subscription you choose. So whether you're looking to try something new or you're looking for a new career path, Boot.dev has you covered. Now let's get back to that Necron Iron Hand. Building a regular run-of-the-mill captain on foot wouldn't have given me the space to really explore how far the Iron Hands could have gone with their mechanical replacements. So I instead settled on building a proxy for a Demon Prince and used the similarly sized Castellax from the Mechanicum battle group that GW had kindly sent me. This model is about the right size for a Demon Prince and is entirely mechanical, making it the perfect starting point. So after removing the parts and cleaning them up of any mold lines, I assembled the main structure of the legs and torso, but didn't glue them together just yet. Normally, the Castellax doesn't feature an actual head. For my build, I needed the model to have a degree of human form. While mechanical, the actual soul of the being inhabiting the robotic shell is still human, so the form should reflect this. My initial thought was to use an aggressor's head to give the model a degree of humanity, but before clipping down the neck, adjusting things with a knife and gluing it in place, I soon realized that this particular head wasn't the best choice. It just protruded too much and was giving me handyman vibes from Bioshock Infinite, so I snapped it off and cleaned up the surface. After a little thinking and playing around with some ideas, I ultimately settled on a combination of the original Castellax plate and a head taken from the Cataphractii Terminator's kit. These are already cut down and fit really nicely against the torso. But first, I wanted to cut down the metal plates to be more of a hood. So, using my saw, the front section of the panel was cut away, I used the seam as a guide, and once removed, the edge was cleaned up. From here, I was able to glue the plate and the helmet to the Castellax torso. This left me with a recognizably Space Marine head and something a little different from the base model. There was still a lot of empty space around the neck though, which needed to be filled in with some extra details. I created these from some guitar strings. I selected one of the strings that was 1mm thick and used a 1mm drill bit to add 2 holes into the existing grooves in the neck. The wire was then bent to a right angle using some pliers and adjusted accordingly, so that it sat flush against the torso. Once I had the wire at the correct length and shape, I superglued it into the hole before repeating it on the other side. 2 more cables were then added, completing the head. While they were originally heavily linked to the Mechanicus, these Iron Hands have turned their back on their former tech support bros, and so their symbol needed to be removed from its armor plate. I did this by carefully shaving away chunks of the symbol until it was mostly removed. From here, the surface was flattened out with a scraping motion. During this whole process, I paid close attention to the rivets on both sides of the plate so that I didn't accidentally remove them. So far, the model was lacking in any Necron parts, but this would soon be remedied with a combination of the bolt cannon and a Tesla carbine taken from the Immortals kit. In order to join these two together, I first cut away the top handle of the carbine. The second handle at the back was then sawn away, along with some of the extra protruding parts. With everything removed, the cuts were cleaned up and smoothed out. Finally, the small block of plastic protruding from the bolt cannon was also cut down before the Tesla carbine was glued to it. This resulted in a weapon that was a combination of human and Necron technology. You may have noticed that I'd missed out the small servo skull that sits in the chest. I originally wasn't planning on using it when I built the torso, but after assembling, I'd realized that the empty space needed filling in. To do this, I simply took the original head, clipped down the sides, spun it around 180 degrees and glued it further into the chest. This provided just enough bulk and a few extra cables to fill in the space nicely. While integrating the Necron weaponry was a good start, I needed something more. After all, the Death Watch of the 41st Millennium have used Necron weapons, so to convey just how much Necron technology had been integrated into the Iron Hands, I decided to add a few parts from a Canoptech Wraith. The first of these were one of the head plates, which I flipped upside down and glued to the chest. This not only covered up the hole, but also helped to convey those familiar Necron orbs and segmented armour. This was continued by taking some orbs from the same kit, clipping away and flattening one end of each, and then also attaching them to the torso. From here, I was left with a much more Necron-coded armour. The Necronification was continued across the arms too, and I started out by building the claws as per the instructions. Onto the wrists of these arms I would attach a pair of Lichguard Hyperphase swords, but they did need to be trimmed down a little first. The blade was first removed from the arm, and a few of the overtly Necron markings were then shaved away. With the blades prepped, they fit nicely between the armor plates of the arm, leaving me with a pair of formidable looking weapons. The final customization saw me adding a few extra Necron details across the model. I created these by clipping away the cylinders from a particle caster and gluing them to the chest and the Gauss cannon. It's a small change, but it helps to create an almost experimental aspect to the integration from Necron technology. With the model built, I then turned my attention to the base. Here I kept things quite simple and just superglued a few chunks of cork to create some simple rocks. To make sure I still had space for the Iron Hand though, I did mark out his feet first. After attaching a few clumps of cork, I added one final detail, a Mark III Space Marine helmet that I'd removed the ball joint from. I'm sure many of you can already guess where I was going with this. You may have noticed that I kept many of the parts separate. This was to make painting them all a little easier. However, to hold these during my painting, I first needed to drill some more 1mm holes into them and superglue them into a few strips of steel wire. These were quite simple, but they did the job. But before I break out the paints, if you are enjoying watching this video so far, then please do leave me a like, and as only about half of you currently watching are subscribed, I'd be extremely grateful if you would consider hitting the subscribe button too. That way you don't miss out on future videos like this. The painting process was started with a black primer, specifically some of Vallejo's black surface primer, which was applied through an airbrush. This created a better surface in which to paint on, whilst also giving me some dark shadows that I would retain in the deeper recesses. When it came to picking a colour scheme, I wanted something that incorporated both the bronze necrodermis of the Necrons, whilst maintaining the black of the Iron Hands. I ultimately settled on a predominantly metallic scheme, with some of the additional armor plates being painted black. To achieve that greenish bronze of the Necron armor, I first sprayed the main torso, arms and cannon with a base coat of Surcoat Silver from the Tooth and Coat range. The airbrush that I'd used for this and subsequent steps wasn't necessary though. It could easily be recreated with a regular brush. The airbrush just helped me to speed things up a bit. With the base metallic in place, I then started to adjust its tone with some Citadel contrast paints. To give the armour a very subtle greenish hue, I created a thin mixture of Plaguebearer Flesh and airbrush thinner and applied a light layer across the tops of the panels. As it dried, it left me with a silvery green colour. The colour of the metallics was then further adjusted with some Ratling Grime. This was focused across all of the armour, but I did keep its application lighter over the areas already covered with Plaguebearer Flesh. As I built up several layers of the paint, I steadily created a bronzed effect. For the numerous seams and recesses dotted across the model, I added more shading with some Garaghak sewer applied directly into them with my brush. I first thinned the mixture out with a little airbrush thinner to reduce the paint's viscosity and allow it to pour more easily into those recesses. To create a little definition in some of the details, I then applied a base coat of Dwarven Iron across a few areas. These included the trim around the neck, the top plate, the weapon belt, and the various piston rods. These silver metallic details kept that mechanical look, whilst adding a little variation. These Dwarven Iron details then had their recesses picked out with a little black legion. Again, I thinned down my mix to allow it to more readily flow into those nooks and crannies. With the base coat and washes complete, I could begin picking out the edges of those with some brighter metallics. These helped to lift out those edges and improve the level of detail in the surfaces. I began this process by lining the edges of the bronzed armour with some Surcoat silver. I then gave the silver metallic details an edge highlight of plate armour. And finally, the corners and various rivets across the metallic areas were picked out with a small dot of Mythril Blade. With the metallic details complete, I could turn my attention to the remaining details. The first of these were the various pipes dotted across the model. These were first given a base coat of Death Reaper, followed by a highlight of Cold Corpse Blue, and then a few small spots of Wolf Grey as an extreme highlight. So far, I'd kept the large shoulder pads in their original black primer and wanted to apply some Iron Hands decals to them. Doing this before any weathering allowed me to cover the markings too, causing them to better blend into the armour. But before any decals could be applied, I first needed to prep the areas I intended to apply the decals to with a coat of gloss varnish. This provided a smoother surface that not only protected the paint beneath, but also allowed the transfer to sit closer to the surface, reducing that ghosting effect that you often get with transfers. From here, I cut out a few transfers from the Mechanicum and Iron Hands decal sheets before soaking them in some water until they lifted from their backing paper. Once they were ready, I carefully teased the transfers away from the backing paper and into place with a damp brush. I gave them some time to dry before then coating them with a product called Microsol. This is a mild solvent that softens the decal. It allows it to better sit across the surface. It did need a couple of coats to sit properly though, so if you're following this yourself, just make sure you allow it to dry fully between applications. Finally, to fix the transfers in place and to dull down that earlier gloss varnish, I gave all the decals a coat of matte varnish, which left me with more of a painted on look. To give the decals the appearance of having been faded or scuffed away, I first gave them a very light airbrush of Doom Death Black. You could also use a dry brush for this. Following this, I then used my regular brush to add some thin lines or scratches over the decals to further improve their weathering. With the decals in place, I moved on to the highlighting of all of those black armor panels. The first highlight was created from a mixture of Death Reaper and Dungeon Stone Grey, followed by edge highlights along the more upper edges using some Dungeon Stone Grey. I also used this to add some extra scratches to the surfaces too. The black armor panels were then finished off with some small dots of Carcharadon Grey. The next area to tackle were the blades on the arm. I wanted to create that classic Necron blade effect, so began by base coating them with some Wyvern Green. To create the transitions, I took some Emerald Green and mixed in plenty of water to create a glaze. Then I approached each flat facet or panel of the blade separately. I would apply the paint to one end and feather it out as I moved down. When I moved horizontally to the next panel, I would invert the direction, but when I moved to the panel down or above, I would retain the same direction. This would result in an almost checkerboard-like pattern where no colour would be positioned directly next to itself, helping to achieve that classic energy weapon effect. The trick here is to not use too much paint in your brush at one time. You're better off applying small amounts, leaving the paint to dry, and then adding more. Building up the layers incrementally will result in smoother results. This glazing process was continued by using some of the much more vibrant Ethereal Green. When applied to the green ends of each panel, it resulted in a much brighter and intense looking energy effect. I then tidied things up with an edge highlight of Talisman Green applied over each panel. before finally picking out the points of the blades with some small dots of Craven Yellow, which created much sharper looking points. For the glowing green details of the model, I began with a base coat of White Star. To create a good solid base coat, I first thinned out the paint and applied several thin layers. For that iconic green glow, I then created a mixture of striking Scorpion Green and Glazed Medium, although Contrast Medium or Lambing Medium could work too. When I applied this mixture over the white details, it gave them a strong green glow effect. After allowing the first layer to dry, I then pushed the intensity even further with subsequent layers. With the bulk of the miniature complete, I could turn my attention to the base. I first tackled the rocks with a series of progressive dry brushes. The first of these was Field Grey, and finally a light dry brush of Kobold Grey to pick out those rock textures. To paint the decapitated helmet, I gave a nod to the fate of Ferrus Manus in the original timeline and started out with some Amethyst Rayne. I then highlighted it with some Sorcerer's Cloak, along with a few small spots of Runic Purple. To paint the metallic trim, I simply followed the same steps that I used to paint the bronzed armour earlier on. With the rocks and the helmet painted, I was then able to remove the Iron Hand Demon prints from his temporary base, clean up the joins, and then attach him to his final base. With the feet in place, I could then fill in the remaining gaps on the base using some AK Dry Ground texture paste. The paste was a little light and lacking in detail though, so I hit it with 2 washes. First, some Battle Mud wash, and then some patches of Archaic Sepia. The mixture of these washes just helped to break up the uniformity of a fairly large area of ground. The base was then hit with a dry brush of Skeleton Legion, and then some Ivory Tusk to complete that dusty effect. With everything painted, all there was left to do now was to remove the models from their holders, clean up the joins, glue them all together and apply a layer of varnish. And with that, I was left with this. And here we have the completed Necron Corrupted Iron Hand. As is always the case with these alternate to heresy builds, they're always incredibly fun. Being able to explore an idea outside the established setting is an excellent opportunity to combine parts and ranges that you wouldn't normally be able to. I'm also really pleased with the results. The combination of build and paint scheme create a strong Necron theme, while still being recognizable as a human construction. Now before I go, I just want to say thank you for making it to the end, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to see me tackle more alternate heresy builds, then please do let me know what units you'd like to see me take on. Now whether or not you decide to build this particular model for yourself, hopefully you managed to pick up something that you found useful in your own projects. But if you would like to recreate this miniature, then you can find all the parts and paints that I used to build it linked in the description below. But before I go, I just want to give my thanks to my Patreon supporters and channel members who help to keep this channel going. Especially my Pouch of Dead Animal Bits and Above supporters, who are Andrew Console, Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Chris Reynolds, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Ilniro Galeri, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Molly Mork, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Palejuice, Ryan Little, Swedsman, Tim, Tom Hay Smith, and War Novice. And my Sergeant level channel members, who are Omnitom, Kutch Kato, Roll 1 to Explode, SO, Phoenix's Den, Lloyd Davies, Trooper Geo, David, John Gibbs, The Sire Acquired, Nerdington Paints, Mark Taylor, Whale Tussler, and Philip Poya. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.